Today we have a really interesting symposium on well-doing, kind of the first of its kind. If you saw the keynote yesterday, well-doing is not sort of common currency yet in the lingo of psychological terminology. So we'll see what some diverse scholars have to say and bring to bear from their own work that hasn't necessarily been sort of originating out of the concept of well-doing, but has many close ties to it. And as Will Fleeson pointed out, as we were getting ready here, this is kind of a interesting or momentous set of speakers for me, because Ken Sheldon was my graduate advisor. I handed off the lab to Mila Titova, who's going to follow Ken. I've done some collaborative work with Jillian Sandstrom, and Will Fleeson was my postdoc advisor. So yeah, whether despite or because of my personality vortex, here we are. It'll be quite a diverse set of topics. So without further ado, Ken, go ahead and take it away with mitigating the risk of prioritizing collective over individual well-being.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Really happy to be here. I'm not talking about anything very formal today. I'm just putting together some ideas that were prompted by an email conversation I had with Falk a few months ago about individual versus collective well-being, and led me to some kind of interesting places that I'll share with you. So in reading the manifesto, it says, first off, that effective well-doing should be sustainable. People have to keep wanting to do the right things. You know, in a way, you look around the world and you think, wow, that's a huge problem. There's all these people doing wrong. But on the other hand, there's a lot of reason for optimism. Like, there's a ton of research in positive psychology that shows that well-doing tends to predict well-feeling, well-being. That doing well tends to make people feel good, feel happy, feel satisfied. And that might even be a basic part of human nature. Dr. Keltner talks about born to be good, you know, and maybe there's a kind of inherent goodness in humans, even though we don't see it sometimes, that can help our job. I could, do the whole talk on this eudaimonic activity model, because I think it's very, very relevant to everything that we're talking about. But I'm only going to give it one slide, but I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about it. So a lot of the research that I've done has involved asking people to set goals of various types, and then over time we measured, does that change their levels of psychological needs satisfaction, and then in the end, does that lead to improved subjective well-being? And it seemed to be a good model to me, and it's told us a lot. But there's these controversies in the well-being literature where we can't agree on what well-being is. I've wanted to keep it here and say it's just feeling good. And isn't it nice that doing good brings feeling good, and you can even prove that that's the best way to do good. But others have said, well, well-being needs to be more than that. It needs to include doing well, or eudaimonic activity. And so this is Frank Martela and I's attempt to pull all this together and create an integrated model, which says well-being consists of doing well and feeling well, and eudaimonic well-being is over here on the doing well side. And there's a lot of different kinds of activities and goals that we've studied that seem to involve doing well, at least in that they produce need satisfaction and subjective well-being, intrinsic value pursuit, balanced time use, self-concordant, goal pursuit, authentic self-experience. All of these produce need satisfaction, which produces subjective well-being. And so this is our attempt to say, hey, we can all be right. We can say that there's more to well-being than just happy. But we can also use happiness as a legitimate objective, in that it's content-free. There's nothing in the measures of well-being that tells what brought the well-being. It's just pure feeling good. And so that's my attempt, our attempt to sort things out and provide a way of thinking about well-doing and how it can be self-reinforcing. You know, that if you can get yourself doing the right things, you'll enter a virtuous cycle where you are feeling better and better, and then you're feeling more like doing well, and then you're feeling better, and kind of an upward spiral is one of the terms people use. Okay. So the nice thing about this is that we can help people do better by showing them that it's the best route to good feelings, even though that's not the point. We've done research where as soon as your goal becomes to feel good, it stops working. You have to do good, and then the feeling good comes as kind of a side effect. But still, it's a very nice side effect because it reinforces moral and virtuous behavior. And these kinds of activities identified as eudaimonic by this measurement strategy that predicts well-being via need satisfaction, they tend to be things that are good for the collective. You know, they're rational, they're cooperative, they're virtuous. And so it appears that individual and collectives might both thrive at the same time simply through eudaimonic activity. But this is what kind of caught me, and what I had this conversation with Falk about, was that it's not about individual well-being, it's about collective well-being. And that makes sense, that if we want a sustainable society and planet, and you know, there has to be some sense in which the collective subsumes the individual. But these are perilous waters because, you know, do we really want to tell individuals they should sacrifice themselves for the collective? You know, I don't think that's working too well for Russians or Chinese, for example. And it made me think of this fortune cookie I got when I was 20 years old. I think it was a typo. I'm pretty sure it was a typo, but a change for the better will be made against you. And I'm like, holy crap, that sucks. And so this reminds me of the group selection controversy. It's an old issue in evolutionary biology. And there was these earlier naive versions of group selection theory, which said, you know, that we evolved to sacrifice for our species, so the lemmings will jump off the cliff when there's overpopulation, because that's what the species needs. And that idea was justly criticized because such behaviors, they couldn't evolve. I mean, you can't really see a way that they would evolve, because the gene being the unit of selection, the behavioral chooser can't do things that would negatively impact their own genes. They would go extinct. If you save the other person's kid instead of your own kid when they both fall off the boat, that behavior is certainly virtuous, but it would go extinct. It would work against your genes. I actually don't really want to go through this. I'll just say quickly, this is a way that I think about the hierarchical organization of reality. And here in personality and cognition, we're making choices and we're influenced by these higher level factors, but we're constituted by these lower level factors. And if we make choices that work against our bodily systems, ultimately the genes contained in our molecules will go extinct. So maybe there's another way to think about this. So we need a game theory perspective to think about what behavioral strategies might boost both individual and collective fitness. And you know, a ton of research on social dilemmas, what enables people to solve social dilemmas and so forth. And I'm not going to go into that, but the basic idea is that cooperation works best at the group level, and it can work best for the individuals within the group, but it depends. If you're an individual within a group that's trying to cooperate and make something happening, let's all do this together, and other people are not reciprocating, if they're exploiting you, then that's self-sacrifice. You're sacrificing yourself for the group and you're losing. So you need others to cooperate at the same time that you're trying to cooperate. And so there's kind of a evolutionary arms race that's been thought about and researched, and so cooperators need a way to mitigate the risks of potentially being exploited. And there's several that have been researched, talked about cheater detection. We're really sensitive to when people start to try to exploit us or cheat, and we might even have an evolved cognitive module that lets us do that. We're very sensitive to reputation. We're going to think about who this person is, what have they done before we decide to cooperate with them. We might be good at assorting with other cooperators right up front so that we get together with other would-be cooperators and we manage to exclude the exploiters. And that's called group assertation. And so I've done a little bit of research I want to share with you on the group assertation strategy. This is really a fascinating little journey that I went on about 20 years ago. It started off, we wanted to show that nice groups finish first. And so we created 3 types of groups: intrinsic groups, mixed groups, and extrinsic groups. And so the intrinsic groups were 4 people who were all high on this REVO, relative intrinsic versus extrinsic value orientation variables, Tim Kasser's construct. And the first look at the data, I found that there was a mean difference. Yeah, so the nice groups had a mean here, mixed groups had a mean here in terms of how much they made. The extrinsic groups had the lowest mean. So I thought, great, nice groups finished first. Then my wife said, well, what's going on inside of those groups? I'd never thought about that. And so I took a look at that, and it was this completely counteracting effect going on inside the groups, so that the more extrinsic you are or exploitive, the more you're making compared to the nicer people inside your own groups. And so it was this paradox where the nice groups are winning, but the nice people are losing within the groups. It's kind of a profound thing. And it also illustrates what's now that the modern perspective on the group selection controversy. David Sloan Wilson, I've done a little work with David, and the idea is that selection operates at multiple levels, and there are things happening at the group levels that affect adaptation for the individual and the individual's genes. And so some groups do better than other groups. And you can think of the African savannah, the prototypical, the villages or tribes that really cooperated well could expand in the population because they were surviving better than other less cooperative groups. Moving really quickly here, but I'm going to get to some cool stuff at the end. All right, so to see these group level effects, you have to disentangle the within and the between effects. So it's a multi-level model perspective. And when we just correlated in that study, the intrinsic value orientation measure with outcomes, there was no connection because there was completely this crossover interaction within and between groups that obscured it. So you have to look at both levels in order to see what's going on. All right, so cooperation only works if others in the group cooperate. So we well-doers, we would like other well-doers to cooperate with us, and we can, make good things happen in the society. But can we get with each other? So that's the question of natural group assertation. This is one of the strategies cooperators can use. So this is a second study we did in this line of work where participants selected friends of theirs to play a game in which they were going to try to win movie tickets. And we measured REVO in both the participants and the friends that they selected so we could see how did they assort. Did they assort by this value, this eudaimonic value orientation? And we found out that they did. There's a pretty substantial ICC, which is the group assertation coefficient. And got ahead of myself. How did we it was basically an NPDG that we put them in with 5 trials, and it's basically you make 5 choices, and each one will compare your choices to the choices of the other people in your group. And this was it was tempting to choose defection because that you're the exploiter in the midst, and you're getting 11 points, and the others are only getting 6. But the more defectors there are, then the worse it is for your group. And now the group's only getting 20 points. It could have got 32 points if everybody had cooperated. So we found basically the same pattern where the nice groups, and these were the people with high intrinsic value orientation who had selected other friends who were similar, those groups won, and they won more of the movie tickets, but there was still this counteracting within group effect where there were individual losers within even the winningest groups. All right, so some implications of this for mitigating the risks for prioritizing collective over individual well-being. We might have 3 goals to mitigate those risks. 1, find ways to reduce the ill-doing of people who choose exploitation over cooperation. And this is like one of the main game theory questions, like how do we punish people who don't go along with the laws, don't follow the rules? Try to boost cooperative norms, more penalties for exploitation. I'll talk more about that in just a couple of slides. Try to boost eudaimonic orientations. So these should all perhaps help to reduce this particular pernicious form of ill-doing. Or maybe show would-be exploiters that that's not going to make you happy. You're going to feel much better if you cooperate and contribute to this group project. Here's another thing that we might try to do is help cooperators detect each other better. We're not really sure how the intrinsic value participants in the study I just showed you, how they detected each other, how they became friends with each other. But there may be some evolved cues. Duchenne smiles might be one of these, that in order to project a true Duchenne smile, you have to be feeling positive emotion. And it has to be kind of open, connective, positive emotion, and then it's expressed in your face. And cooperators may smile more in this way, and they may recognize those smiles in each other, and they may decide that's who I want to hang out with. Of course, the exploiters might also, it's an arms race. They might also learn to detect these smiles, but I don't think they can do it as well because they're not feeling that feeling. They're not resonating with the other person. You know, they're trying to exploit. They're in this sort of narrow, selfish space. The third thing we could do would be to help cooperators assort with each other. Actually, this is the same thing as the second one. So anyway, now I want to get into just a couple of speculative slides. So as I'm thinking about the problem of saving the planet, uniting humanity, blah, blah, it doesn't actually look very hopeful to me. Maybe amazing things will happen, but what would make a difference? I don't know. Here's just a thought. We need a new religion, or maybe we already have it, Gaianism, in which maybe there could come to be pressure to declare fealty or not to this emerging zeitgeist or perspective that people are increasingly recognize is needed to survive. And what if those who declare such fealty are expected to adopt higher moral and ethical standards? And what if those who don't declare fealty, they're holdouts, they're resisting, they're reactant, they're anti-vaxxers, you name it, but they might be viewed with suspicion. These are people that seem to want to retain license to exploit others. And we might be pretty careful before we decide to assort with those people. And so what you can get if something like this happens is Simpson's paradox, which is, the paradox is that cooperation can spread in a population even though cooperators still lose within groups. They're always at a disadvantage within groups. But the bigger their groups get and the higher the level of cooperation within those groups, the more it spreads in the population nonetheless. So, I mean, that's kind of seems like what needs to happen, is that people more and more become very allegiant to this new or higher order perspective on this planet that we live on and what it's going to take to preserve it. And I just finished reading this book. I have to share it with you. It's relevant. I think you'll see why. Kim Stanley Robinson, he's the world's best science fiction author. He just published a book last October, The Ministry for the Future, which provides about a 60-year window on what changed such that we turned around the climate disaster and the temperature started to come back down in the 2070s. And it was this series of radical changes. It's a very optimistic book, but at the same time, it's quite cynical because it's, it talks about all these entrenched propensities that are going to have to be overcome to make these transitions. And the funny thing is that the turnover happened because the radicals got more and more radical. And they started doing things like using drones to shoot down airplanes, passenger planes, because that's a huge problem for carbon, and so that made it so people started to fly in blimps, and they started to take ships, and there weren't any more passenger planes, and they also started to assassinate the CEOs of the oil companies and anybody that was still contributing to more and more carbon. And, is that a religion? I don't know. Maybe it's kind of like a religion that these people became so attracted, dedicated to this idea that they got deadly serious about protecting it. I guess this is my last question. Is that well-doing? So these are people who became radicalized and started assassinating those who were standing in the way, but maybe that was the only way that things were going to change. And if you read the book, it just barely happened anyway. And that was a big part of it. All right, so that's pretty much all I've got. I've thrown a lot of ideas out here. I wasn't trying to do anything very formal. I'm just thinking about the individual versus the collective, and how far does well-doing extend? Does it involve sacrificing yourself for the collective? Does it involve sacrificing others for the collective? And it might be that those kinds of questions have to be considered. So actually, I'll stop talking there, and I'm happy to have a conversation or whatever. Thank you. Let's see.
Yeah, so we have a couple minutes for questions live right now. If anyone wants to raise their hand, feel free. Okay, so we've already got one here.
Yes, one question. What is your position about civil disobedience movement like Extinction Rebellion?
I don't actually know anything about that. I want to find out about it now. But what I was saying at the end was that might be necessary. There might need to be radical civil disobedience. But that's a little bit different from this question of helping cooperators not get exploited. But they do merge together, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we could maybe acknowledge here that there might be a sort of quadrant, if you imagine sort of a grid, right, where actions are altruistic but not virtuous, depending on what your moral system is, right? You might have some deontological rules that prevent you from killing exploiters, even though sort of definitionally, like punishing exploiters can be considered an altruistic activity. Did we have another question, Will?
Sure. A few. They're in this chat, but it looks, I haven't already written in the chat. It looks like I see a couple other hands, so I'll defer to them.
Okay, then. Next up, we have Charlene.
Thank you. I was just wondering if the view of our relation to the collective it should always be negative. I'm thinking that sacrificing may not be the only way in which we could see our relation to the collective, and that maybe there's some interplay between times of sacrifice and times of rising to the top. So just your views on that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to say that the relation to the collective is negative. Ideally, it's very positive and everybody's doing great and they're feeling good together and they're part of a group project. Instead, I would say that there's vulnerability to being part of a collective, in that you might be trying to help the collective and others might be trying to get, things for themselves that work against you and also work against the collective. So I just think it's important to be alert to that as a cooperator and not just let yourself be exploited when you realize that's happening.
Peter?
Yeah, that was really fascinating. And I was just thinking about applying this to racism or sexism or like Hitler. Hitler, is obviously an exploiter, non-cooperator. Is killing Hitler, and this is, people have raised this idea many times, or killing Hitler's mother a good idea? So it sounds like, you're sacrificing the defector for the good of the collective. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, that was kind of what happened in this book that I was talking about. I highly recommend that you weren't going to have a collective unless you could get rid of some of these really high-end, high-scale defectors and exploiters. And so that might put you in an awkward moral position of doing something that you should never do, but it's necessary. I hope I'm never in that position myself, but you could see how we might get there.
Okay, next, John.
Hi there. Thanks a lot for the talk. It was very interesting. So I'm curious, you presented these cases where you have these studies and you have this kind of Simpsons paradox phenomenon where the groups with more well-doers do better than the groups without them, but the well-doers within those groups don't do as well with respect to perhaps the defectors within those groups. That kind of phenomenon, although you might describe it in different ways. So my question is, how generalizable do you think that phenomenon is? Do you think that that characterizes most or all of the contexts where there's a potential for well-doing, or do you think that maybe something about the specific cases that you're looking at means that it just happens in that context, but not in general? What are your thoughts about how generalizable that phenomenon is?
Yeah. Well, these are pretty central and basic tenets in game theory, and that's a huge field, and it's supposed to describe an enormous number of processes and outcomes. I think it's most relevant when you're in a situation where the question is, do you trust the others around you or not? And maybe you shouldn't, because if you do, you might get exploited. And so I think there's a huge number of social situations, institutional situations that are like that, where we would like to do the right thing, but we're not sure we can trust others to not exploit that. Can we trust them to go along with that and make it bigger? And so I think this is a huge problem for well-doing, and there's ways around it. I've tried to mention a few possibilities, but it's evolution has always been about, okay, one cell or two cells coming together. Now, can they trust each other? A human body, can it trust itself, or is there going to be cancer? Can you trust your spouse? Can you trust your group? So it's these higher level collectives that are evolving, and it's always the issue of, are they going to strike out on their own, or are they going to paddle the same way? So I do think that these are really basic questions.